Hello, everyone. Good afternoon if you're toward the eastern part of the country. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm a senior associate and planner with Roadside in Harwell, based in Alexandria, Virginia. But today I'm representing the Sustainable Communities Division of APA, and we are the host for today's webinar. The division supports planners who are committed to planning for sustainable communities by integrating all aspects of sustainability into our work through the combined economic, social, and ecological factors that shape our communities. Today, our topic is solar planning and zoning from the rooftop to the solar farm. But before we get into the meat of our discussion today, I do want to acknowledge our division sponsors. So thank you very much to all these organizations who help us put on events. Our sponsors this year include Clarion, Dewberry, Farr Associates, HAF, Niche Engineering, Robinson & Cole, Smith Group JJR, U.S. Green Building Council, CDP Engineers, Montgomery Associates, TESCA, and TransformativeTools.org. So thank you again to our sponsors and to all of our division members. If anyone's interested, we are also currently exploring both annual sponsorship opportunities and sponsorship for the upcoming division reception at the National Planning Conference. So if you're interested in either or both of those, please reach out to Meryl St. Leger-Demian, who's listed here on the slide. Also, if you're interested in upcoming activities or getting in touch with us, we have that information on the slide. If you want to share ideas for upcoming webinars, please just shoot us an email at apascd@gmail.com, or you can connect with us on social media as listed here. We do have an exciting event coming up, sort of a shoulder event with the National Planning Conference, and that's an Eco Districts Foundations course and workshop happening on April 20th, so the day before the National Planning Conference starts. And so you can find out more information about that and any other upcoming events at sustainableplanning.net. So today's event. Again, today's event is called Solar Planning and Zoning from the Rooftop to the Solar Farm. And we have 3 speakers. I'll introduce them all briefly now, but then I'll let them say any more that they'd like to say when it's their turn to speak. Our first speaker, Brian Ross, has 25 years of experience working on local sustainability and clean energy topics, including local government policy and regulation, state policy and rules, and energy utility regulation. He currently leads the Great Plains Institute's Solar Energy Market Transformation, working across the Midwest and nationally, helping local and regional governments develop solar-ready policies and regulatory standards. Megan Day leads research, analysis, and technical assistance on municipal energy planning and policy, utility-scale photovoltaic development, and integrating solar in local land use and zoning codes. She manages the city's Leading Through Energy Analysis and Planning, or Cities LEAP project, which provides localized energy data and analysis for every U.S. city to enable more strategic energy decisions. Our final speaker, James Schroll, is a project manager for the Solar Foundation's SolSmart program. Prior to joining the Solar Foundation, James worked for both the Office of Government Relations at the Corporation for National and Community Service and the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor. He's also the vice chair of the Arlington, Virginia County Board. Before we get started, I just want to remind you that you can submit questions throughout the presentation using the chat box or by using the built-in Q&A function, which looks like a little speech bubble, I believe, at the top of your screen. We will have questions at the end of all presentations. And if you are having difficulties seeing the presentation at any point, please send me a message through that chat box, and I'll work with you to get that resolved. Thank you all again for joining us, and I will now invite Brian Ross to start his presentation.
Okay, can you see things?
Looks like it's coming up. I can see your screen, but it's the AnyMeeting website.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering about, what just happened. Sorry.
No worries. Maybe just try clicking on
There we
point
go.
at the bottom. There we go. Okay.
Oh,
Perfect.
okay, now you can see my screen. All right.
Yep.
Sorry for the confusion. All right. So, hello everyone. This is I'm Brian Ross, as introduced. So, I am going to talk about the first part of our session in terms of the planning element of our solar energy webinar. Should mention the Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization that works regionally and nationally on clean energy issues. We've been around for around 20 years. We do a lot of work with utilities and ISOs and RTOs on transmission planning, as well as kind of at the national scale and then all the way down to the community scale. I'm part of the communities division of Great Plains Institute, where we do work mainly in the Midwest, but somewhat nationally on a variety of sustainability issues and clean energy issues, helping cities and regional governments integrate and kind of track the changing markets in market transformation efforts. So I always start my presentations with my conclusions, so that if you kind of drift off, as you're on the webinar, as long as you remember this slide, you'll be okay. So the one thing you need to remember is that good plans enable good development, and that applies to solar energy like it does to anything else. Solar energy is an economically valuable local resource today in most parts of the country. As a consequence, these valuable resources, as they get developed, really should benefit both the owner of the resource and the community, and that the communities will do that mainly by laying a good policy foundation in local plans, primarily the comprehensive plan, but also some other kinds of plans that lay the foundation for regulation and programs at the local level that enable the capture of benefits and minimization of risks of solar development. So that's kind of the planning background here. And I wanted to kind of start about why now we're talking about energy in the comprehensive plan. Comprehensive plans, of course, have traditionally covered a variety of different resources, natural resources, development patterns, mix of uses, economic resources, transportation infrastructure, and how we dispose of land or develop land. And this is something that planners are comfortable with and understand how this works and how the different elements of planning come into play about evaluating the interplay of these different resources. But one of the things that also comprehensive plans also do is they provide direction to the community in response to changing and evolving markets and changing technologies. I had this idea throwing this up. We know how land use and the communities have changed as transportation infrastructure has changed over time. Looking back historically from the horse and buggy up to the automobile and how that changed things, and then as we're looking forward, kind of in that automobile frame, from traditional autos to EVs and to potentially autonomous vehicles, and the current debate going on in the planning world about how that may change all of our land use patterns or have great effects on a lot of the things that we do. And this is part of what comprehensive planning needs to do. It needs to look at these evolving markets and changing technologies and provide some guidance to communities as this is going on. The American Planning Association has recognized this and has developed a number of materials that have a great deal of the work that we're going to present today that is available to APA members, and actually some of this material is available to anybody because it was developed in conjunction with the US DOE for general consumption. But planning solar energy in particular as part of a comprehensive plan is something that has been the APA has been working on since I think 2010 or 2011, and they had developed a planning for solar energy planning advisory service report that you can see here that is in fact available to anybody who wants to reference it. It's a few years old, but it's still pretty good. And one of the things that it kind of talks about is how, in regard to my presentation here, how local policy really guides development markets and development forms in a variety of different ways. We do have the comprehensive plan, which we're going to be focused on primarily today as the vehicle for policy around solar energy and solar development. But there are also other kinds of plans that come into play, such as sub-area plans, where you can get into more detail about solar and how it fits in at a more granular scale into the community as part of that planning effort, and something that communities should consider when they do those kinds of plans, as well as functional plans, which include, as noted here, energy plans, climate action plans, green infrastructure or sustainability plans, which are obviously specifically relevant to solar energy. Just kind of an example, we do see a number of communities that have gone down this path. We have a large movement in the nation that is addressing in their plans, or either in comprehensive plans or in functional plans, clean energy and solar energy. And this is something that I think that there's a growing interest in and a growing challenge to planners about how to do this in a way that really makes some sense. And of course, a plan, any kind of plan, follows the same format. We identify existing conditions, we identify desired conditions, and then we identify strategies to move from existing to our desired endpoints. But one of the biggest challenges around solar is energy in the plan is that people have difficulty understanding what the existing conditions are for solar energy. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is thinking about energy as a local resource, as kind of a solar reserve, which nobody knows what I'm talking about until I say, well, everybody knows what an oil and gas reserve is. And everyone nods their heads. Normally, when I'm presenting this in front of an audience, I ask for a show of hands. I won't ask for that today because I can't see you. But the people are comfortable with this term, and even the general population is comfortable with this concept of oil and gas reserves. And what we're showing here is the definition of what a reserve is. That was created by the Security and Exchange Commission. And you might ask, why does the Security and Exchange Commission have a definition of what an energy reserve is? And this is because these are assets that go on companies' books, and the Security and Exchange Commission wants to make sure that the assets that are going on companies' books are real and have real value. And so they come up with this definition, the quantities of oil and gas, which by analysis of geoscience, engineering data, estimated with reasonable certainty to be economically producible from a given date forward, et cetera, et cetera. This is kind of how they define that there's actually value in this resource. But we can take that same language and say, well, let's define solar energy reserves, that those quantities of solar energy, which by analysis of atmospheric and land cover data can be estimated with reasonable certainty to be economically producible, et cetera, et cetera. Because when we start defining the solar energy is in terms of its physical characteristics, that solar energy is where the sun is hitting the ground. It is not where the sun is not hitting the ground, such as under a tree. So it's really a detailed shading analysis. The solar reserve in a community is defined primarily by local conditions. We tend to think of having the desert Southwest as having this great solar reserve, and other parts of the country as not being so good. But in fact, the local landscape is what defines the solar reserve in a community, because a solar panel underneath a tree doesn't work any better in Arizona than it does in Minnesota. So that's really what happens. And when we start defining solar energy reserves as this, according to these physical characteristics, we actually can start to map it out and measure it. And we have done that for a number of communities in the Midwest that we work with. Here's an example of St. Louis Park, which is a suburban community in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area that just actually completed a climate action plan, one of the most aggressive in the nation, climate neutral by 2040. But we measured what their solar reserve was, and we came up with a gross solar reserve of about 940 megawatts worth of generating capacity, which is the size of a coal-fired power plant. And then we took just the rooftop energy reserves, kind of clipping the energy data the solar data to the rooftop, and discovered that it was about 43% of their total annual electric use if you captured it all, which is a pretty substantial number, and it gives local governments a sense of what the economic value is of this resource. You can look at this same kind of rooftop reserve concept in many places across the country. Google Project Sunroof provides some pretty good data in populated areas across the nation. Here's the city of Rockford, Illinois, where the solar data is roughly 80% of the estimated electric energy use, or for in this case, we're just looking at the kind of cohort of cities that are similar to Rockford, and Megan may actually touch on this, where we're using the state and local energy database from NREL. City of Greeley, Colorado, another example where the solar reserve is the rooftop solar reserve is somewhere around 78% of estimated electric use on an annual basis. Salem, Oregon, another example that I just pulled up, where we're looking at 71% of estimated electric use. So you can see that the solar reserve, the actual resource, is something that can be measured and it can be quantified in your comprehensive plan. For a lot of communities anyway, and something that kind of is a starting point to help people understand the value of this resource. So we run a program, or just up till recently ran a program called Grow Solar Partnership in the Midwest, and as part of that we developed what does it mean to be a solar-ready community in terms of understanding your resources and the development patterns. And we came up with 5 principles about that. In order to be solar-ready, you need to have comprehensive plans that describe your solar resource and encourage development. Really, that's the existing conditions kind of piece and desired conditions. We need development regulations that address solar development in its varied forms. You need to have permitting processes that are predictable, transparent, and documented. You need to have public sector investment in the community's own solar resource on public buildings and lands, and you need to have local programs that address the economic market barriers that limit the private sector. And this is kind of the root of the SoulSmart program that James is going to go into. And I am going to talk about just the number 1, the comprehensive plan portion of that, for the rest of my session here. So what does it mean to have a comprehensive plan that is solar ready? Really, you need to identify and define the solar resources. You need to acknowledge solar development benefits and co-benefits. So you need to say, why is this a benefit to the community? You need to identify the development opportunities for solar energy in your community and the potential conflicts in the community. And then finally, really, the comprehensive plan should set some kind of a development target or goal for kind of development that you'd like to see over the tenure of the plan. So those kind of 4 points that I'll dive into just a little bit here. So the first part is they identify and define solar resources, and I just gave you a series of descriptions about how that can be done and has been done in different parts of the country. And the example I wanted to put out here, where this is now currently being done, is in the metropolitan area of Minneapolis-St. Paul, 7-county regional government, which has regulatory authority over the 188 local governments that do comprehensive planning and which all have to match the regional plan in terms of the overall goals and be consistent with it. And there is a provision in Minnesota state law that all of these local governments, all 188, must include in their comprehensive plans an element for the protection and development of solar resources. And so this is something that's been there a long time. The Metropolitan Council just recently, this year, as we're ramping up, or actually in the middle of and approaching near the end of the comprehensive planning process for all these 188 local governments, realized that the old way we looked at this resource was not sufficient, and actually mapped out all of the solar resources for every one of these 188 local governments, provide them a map and a quantification of the total solar resource and the rooftop solar potential, kind of like I just presented to you a few minutes ago, and then ask them that they must include in their plan community goals that address the protection and development of solar resources. And different communities are taking that in different ways. Some are being very aggressive about developing their solar resources. Other ones are being very timid or restricting some elements of solar development in their community. But nevertheless, it sets what the community wants to see about identifying and defining what the resource is and how they want to address it moving forward. And there's actually some existing, there's some guidance that you can reference on the Met Council website in the local planning handbook there about different kinds of goals that are available and the kind of way that this has been addressed in that regional government jurisdiction. Another point on the comprehensive plan is that the plan needs to acknowledge the solar development benefits and desired co-benefits that the community would like to achieve. One of the things that, for instance, we see frequently is the job creation benefits, the economic benefits of solar development. Development is development, whether it's solar or other kinds. It has a job and an economic benefit associated with it, and there's a number of different elements to that are specific to solar energy. It is job creation, obviously. It creates new markets for local contractors as you kind of go through the market transformation process, giving some diversity of income to the contractors, but also to landowners where you're doing siting of solar farms or gardens, where there's a new income stream. And also then there, of course, there's a local resource import substitution benefit of using a local resource for energy rather than a distant one that you may be importing. An example of how this has been done in the communities that we've worked with, Lynn County, Iowa, in their comprehensive plan, 2013 comprehensive plan, they did in their economic development section, they have here a goal about seeking opportunities to diversify and expand local employment base, and they have in one of their objectives specifically tied that to renewable energy production and all the related supported businesses. And the strategy they have is to make sure that their policy and regulation allows for, and I'll just talk about solar, allows for solar energy production and the related businesses where appropriate, where they meet the rest of the community standards. So this is an example of how that economic benefit has been wrapped into the comprehensive plan. Another example of something that people frequently don't think of but is becoming increasingly important is the natural resource co-benefit that you can get from certain kinds of solar development. Planners understand and have been through the process probably many times of how we have learned to incorporate natural systems and natural system functions into development. So when a housing development goes up, we now have to pay attention to how the hydrology works on that site, and to make sure that we're not dumping a lot of stormwater onto adjacent sites, because that's a natural system that we need to protect. Similarly, there even in housing and other kinds of development, there are standards for protecting things like habitat systems, linear greenways, all those kinds of things. The same kind of concept about looking at natural systems is something we can look at for solar development. We can do solar development. We can choose to do solar development in order to capture habitat value. There's a whole movement around pollinator ground cover, and the picture in back of here is an example of that, where the entire development area is pollinator ground cover that's native to the region where the solar farm is going into place. And there was actually an article today in where was it? In Ohio, I believe, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is now looking at solar farm development as an opportunity to do habitat value and also to do water quality protection. By replacing marginal cropland and creating buffers where the solar farms are, you actually limit the amount of stormwater runoff and improve water quality. And then also you can incorporate agricultural practices into this, and I think Megan may provide a few examples of this, where beekeeping, grazing, haying are all opportunities to kind of capture co-benefits, but only if you as a local government plan for it, because it won't necessarily happen if you just say, go forth and develop a solar farm. So the third point, what is a comprehensive plan that is solar ready, is identifying solar development opportunities and conflicts in the community. When we've worked with probably hundreds of communities between the three of us across the nation, and we have seen some things that come up over and over when people talk about solar development and how it conflicts with other goals in the communities. How does solar come into conflict with agricultural practices if you have a goal to protect agricultural practices in your county or in your region? What about urban forests? Solar and urban forests, they don't necessarily work very well together. How are they in conflict? Historic resources, something we want to protect. Is doing solar development on historic resources a conflict, or is it something we can do in a reasonable manner? Redevelopment and density goals. How do you make sure as you're densifying an area that you're not also taking impacting the solar resource for that area? What about airports? Does solar fit with an airport? Is it a conflict? Do we have issues? What other kinds of priority infrastructure might be impacted by solar farm development? And of course, natural areas as something that we sometimes treat solar in our ordinances as industrial land uses, which we don't want in natural areas. But is that necessarily appropriate? And each one of these has an answer. And I would assert that if solar development is done incorrectly, we do end up with conflicts in these resources. If solar development is done correctly, we can end up, in many cases, actually creating a synergy rather than a conflict with these other resources. And to kind of give an example of that, the Stearns County Minnesota comprehensive plan includes two goals here in their environment and natural resource section of their plan. One is to ensure reasonable and responsible use of natural resources, and specifically under one of their objectives, encouraging the use of renewable energy systems, including wind energy and solar energy. They also have the very next goal is protect agricultural natural resources, protecting ag soils and other ag resources, and encouraging sustainable agricultural practices. So they themselves came up with a conflict where there was solar farms going into place, and people were saying, is this in conflict with our agricultural natural resource and agricultural soils protection? And they came up with some solutions for that actually ended up enhancing, we think, the agricultural protection goals. Because one of the things in agriculture, when we look at why we do agricultural protection in plans, is we have a number of different goals that we're trying to achieve. Not necessarily all of these, but certainly this is the range of things we look at. Protecting soils, protecting productive capacity from an economic standpoint, concerns about fragmentation of land and diminishment of land value as it relates to agriculture, encouraging secondary development impacts by putting housing out in agricultural areas, which then has further fragmentation issues, and consequently nuisances associated with agricultural practices when you start putting people out there. And actually, if we look at this kind of list about what we're trying to get to with agricultural protection, solar development in those areas can actually help minimize some of these, and even can, in some cases, potentially enhance the value of certain of these resources. So, as an example of, the final point is comprehensive plans that set development targets, and we have a couple examples here. Town of Dartmouth. This is, I think, a fairly old now comprehensive plan. I think it dates back to 2007 or 2009, where they included specific goals about promoting and supporting renewable energy in their plan, including establishing 10 and 20-year goals for renewable energy use by municipal buildings. And as a result of that plan, they ended up approving a fairly large solar development that I think they actually had more solar per capita in their town than anyone else in Massachusetts, and maybe even larger in the country, at least for a while, because they found opportunities to develop solar on, I believe it was on a closed landfill. And I think Megan knows this project a little bit better than I, but this is an example of how setting goals can actually result in good things. And similarly, obviously, when we look at something like a functional plan, here's the example of the Salt Lake City Climate Positive Plan, where they have set a goal of 100% community-wide renewable energy by 2032 and 50% renewable for the municipal operations by 2020. Very aggressive goals. There's a cohort of a growing cohort of cities across the nation that have adopted 100% renewable goals in some form, and this is something that we're seeing very frequently. And getting to the kind of next steps of this is the next trick, because this is an achievable goal, but it's not an easy goal. So setting the goal is important because it does define what you're going to do moving forward. So that's kind of the framework that I wanted to provide, because I know that now Megan and James are going to talk about how we actually do this stuff once we've set goals.
Thanks, Brian. Can you folks hear me okay?
Yep, you sound great.
Great. Okay. Switch over to zoning for solar. So thank you, Brian, for providing the context as to why and how we could integrate solar into our comp plans and our goals. I'm going to dive into some more specifics as to how that translates into solar in your zoning code and some considerations therein. So the first thing that a lot of people...
Sorry, could you just hide those notifications at the bottom of your screen?
Hide.
There's a little bar at the bottom. There we go. Thank you.
Thanks. So in working with communities across the country, I often get the response that, well, we allow solar, but we don't mention it in our zoning code, and we don't need to because it's just assumed that we can do this. And I will quote the American Planning Association that said in their solar briefing papers, a conspicuous silence on the part of local policies, plans, and regulations on the topic of solar energy constitutes a significant barrier to adoption and implementation of these technologies. So think of the land use context where you have a neighbor who's opposing an installation and you have nothing written in your zoning code as to solar development, and so you leave your community and the property owner at risk and potential liability for that land use, which is not included in your zoning code and not mentioned anywhere. So there's a lot of different ways and considerations to look at when you're looking at integrating zoning, solar in your zoning code. And I'll get into each of these in a little bit of detail. But the foundation is your definition. And I encourage a very broad definition. So here we've got a solar energy system, and it starts with a device or structural design feature, a substantial purpose of which is to provide daylight or interior lighting. So here we've got passive solar considerations included in this definition, so it's very wide. For the collection storage, I would really encourage you to include the word storage in your definition because increasingly we're going to see battery storage integrated with solar energy systems, both at the residential as well as the large scale. So collection, storage, and distribution of solar energy for space heating or cooling, electricity generation, or water heating. So we've got solar thermal also included with PV in that broad definition as an example. And then I would encourage you to go into some greater detail to distinguish between different types of solar energy systems. And here we've defined different scales based on area. And I would really encourage you to look at area rather than capacity, because if you say, base your regulation on 250 kilowatts, for example, that size and the footprint of that facility will change over time as efficiencies and technologies change. So we want to, in our zoning code, address the impacts, and that is really the footprint or the area that's being impacted. So I would encourage some distinctions between different sizes and scales so you can apply appropriate regulations based on the scale. And then, in addition, also distinguish between rooftop and ground-mounted systems because, again, you want to look at those a little bit differently in your regulations and land uses. So here's an example of something that I've seen where the definition kind of went wrong. So the Denver zoning code, the only definition they have is solar panel, flush mounted. So I imagine if you do anything but a flush mounted to the rooftop system, you've got to get a variance. So it would prevent something like you see on the right here. This is a factory in Massachusetts where the solar panels are on a flat roof, and they're obviously not flush mounted to that flat roof. They are tilted such that the facility is going to be more efficient. And also in places like Massachusetts, they're going to shed snow in the winter when they're tilted like that. So if your definition requires flush mounting to the rooftop, I would highly encourage you to provide an exception for flat roofs to enable those solar energy systems to be more efficient and tilted to meet their latitude and also to shed snow and dust and the like in the winter and in the summer. And then here, I see this a lot where communities try to regulate the use. So here's an example. In Adams County, Colorado, they say that a solar energy system shall be designed to only provide energy for the property on which it is located. So you're basically requiring net metering for any kind of solar energy system, which would, again, prevent the picture, the system that you see in this picture, which is one of 1,500 customer-sited PV systems that are owned by the utility. And this is a a utility business model that we're seeing more and more, where they're trying to often extend the benefits of solar to low-income households. So here, this is a system that connects directly to the grid. It is not net metered on that house, and that house instead receives a monthly lease payment for the use of their rooftop. So this definition of the solar energy system, when it's trying to regulate where those electrons go, which is a very hard thing to do, they would actually prevent these kinds of programs. So again, we want to regulate the impact and not the use or the capacity. Height is, of course, another consideration. Here, Adams County has provided an allowance, which is something that will help remove barriers to solar energy systems, particularly when those systems are on buildings that already meet the maximum height limitations. So they've provided an allowance of 5 feet above the maximum height restriction for each district, which is a good standard. Aesthetics will, of course, vary depending on your community, but here is an example that would prevent a lot of solar energy systems. So in Maplewood, Minnesota, they're saying that it must be building integrated, essentially, or screened from public view from the public right-of-ways. And so that would, again, prevent this system that we're looking at, which is an affordable housing project in Denver, where you can obviously see the solar energy system from the road. So if your community is very concerned about aesthetics, I would encourage you to require flush mounting to pitched roofs with an exception for flat roofs, and have perhaps some other considerations there. But, you know, that's not so offensive to see that, right? I think it's a hopeful thing. However, in historic or special use districts, we do want to regulate what we see, and aesthetics are certainly a much greater consideration. So in the 2,400 local jurisdictions that have historic preservation ordinances, Brian touched on this, we want to provide some guidance so that they know that you can still install solar and what ways we want to do that. So you may have here that you don't want to see it from the public right-of-way, with the exception of alleys, because that would prevent a lot of solar. Breckenridge, Colorado has provided guidance that solar energy should be installed on non-historic buildings in their historic district, or building additions, and integrated into building design. So Plano, Texas has some good guidance here. We see a picture of how this solar energy systems might be installed on historic buildings, and then some ways that they want to see those installations protect the integrity of the historic buildings. Roof coverage is another consideration, which is primarily due to safety concerns. So here you want to coordinate with your fire department, because roof coverage is meant to make sure that there is an allowance for egress for firefighters, and that's generally along ridges and edges of the rooftop so that they can access it for fighting fires and also sometimes for venting. Although not every fire district uses venting as a practice, so you might want to coordinate with your fire chief and see what kind of protections they want and access to those roofs that they want to have. Here's an example from the state of Oregon, where they're providing guidance where if a solar installation has a coverage of 25% or more of the roof area, they want access on the side and the ridge. If it's smaller than that, they just want ridge access. So there's a good resource there for roof access considerations. And then solar access, Brian mentioned this a lot. There's a lot of different ways to come at this, but it's important to look at how you're going to protect those solar energy resources and installations once they are installed so that they can still function over their useful life. And there's many different approaches. So you can kind of run the spectrum from encouraging private landowners to get private easements if they install a system, to the Boulder, Colorado approach, where there's a solar fence, a hypothetical fence around each property that preserves the right of each property to receive a certain amount of sunlight, regardless of whether there is a solar energy generation system or not. So that's kind of where your community falls along that tolerance for regulation spectrum. But in general, bottom line, we encourage, and this is a SolSmart criteria that's pretty important, is to allow solar energy systems as an accessory use in all districts. And you can regulate that based on the sizes and the types that we define in our definition section. But that's a basic, I think, removal of a barrier and allowance for solar that we should be working towards in our zoning code. So now as I move towards large-scale systems and some special considerations for those systems, let's look at some of the considerations that your community and planners may have about what are the impacts of these solar energy systems. So glare tends to come up a fair amount, less so now that people are getting used to these installations. You can see in this picture that the color of the panels is very dark blue to black, and if they're reflecting light, they're not doing their job. They need to be absorbing that light in order to convert it into electricity. So solar modules are actually less reflective than windows and water. So if you're considering requiring a glare study for every solar installation, then you might want to consider that also for every window in your community, because it's really, it can be an issue, and the Federal Aviation Administration takes care of that by requiring glare studies for installations on or near airports. So you can leave it to the FAA and not worry too much about glare. So let's look at some large-scale solar, because obviously you want to regulate this in a different way. You don't want to allow this as a use by right in every zoning district, but you want to have some sort of a regulatory pathway, especially for those counties out there and those areas where there's some more land availability. So this is a 15-megawatt facility in Florida, of course, with an aerial view. And you can see that actually the retaining pond there for the gas facility behind in the back, it's actually more reflective than the solar panels. But this is what we usually see, right? We see it from the road, and we see the fence and the first couple rows of modules. So that fence is 6 feet high with another foot of barbed wire, and that's pretty typical of what is required for security and safety, and what you'll see unless you have aesthetic concerns and you require different fencing. And that's a 19-megawatt facility in Arizona. Or you might see something like this, as Brian showed. This is a facility in Minnesota if you require some more pollinator-friendly revegetation. So some common concerns, again, the glare, it's less reflective than water and windows. It's very low noise. The inverters do make a hum, but it's less than the noise of a refrigerator when you're about 10 meters away. You will hear maybe some whirring for tracking facilities as those torque tubes move over the course of the day, but it's, again, pretty slight, and outside the fence line, it's going to be more like ambient noise. These are safe facilities. The modules carry warranties. All the equipment is electrical, meets safety standards, and is UL listed generally. And they're low voltage. Sometimes people have concerns about electromagnetic fields, and the 1,000 to 1,500 volt systems that you see in utility-scale solar farms is actually, well, it's a lot less than a 500,000 volt transmission line, which is a 500 kV line. So you might want to worry about those more. So what kind of a land use is a solar farm? Brian touched on this as well, but I want to encourage you not to restrict solar farms to industrial zoning, because it can basically amount to spot zoning. Industrial uses in our historic zoning regulation are ways to separate conflicting neighboring land uses, right? We want to separate land uses that have noise, traffic, pollution, none of which solar energy facilities have. I had a city administrator once described a solar farm as something like a cemetery in its land use. There are no living inhabitants, and some things sticking out of the ground, but not much noise or traffic for these facilities. So if we require them to be on commercially or industrially zoned land, we're requiring them to pay for all the services therein that they don't need, like water, sewer, gas lines, access to highway transportation or rail. None of these are necessary for a solar farm. Also, industrially zoned parcels can be urban, small, and also expensive. So I would encourage you to allow solar farms through a conditional or special use permit process, so you can consider each in its own context and apply conditions as necessary. And allow them in rural, agricultural, commercial, industrial, and even some less dense residential zones, and consider them each in their unique context. Because just one more note on that, if you require a site to be rezoned to industrial, after the 25-year or 30-year lifespan of a solar project, you can pull those posts out and remove all the facility equipment, and you could revert it back to agricultural use. But if you've required a rezone, you now have maybe a factory or some intense land use coming into that area that you didn't want. So try to avoid spot zoning in those cases. So again, Brian touched on the whole solar farms and agriculture, and I want to encourage you to think of these as not necessarily mutually exclusive. So again, these solar farms are not toxic. It's glass that the water is hitting over that 25 to 30-year lifespan, and you can pull out the equipment and revert right back down to an agricultural use. And you've had a field that's basically laid fallow with perennial vegetation, ideally, on that site for many years. So you might have a more productive agricultural resource in the end. But there are also co-location of agriculture and solar farm examples, and we're working on some research to that end here at NREL. So here you see sunflowers for oil production on a solar farm in Wisconsin. There's also sheep grazing. Grazing is a common vegetation management practice in North Carolina. Sheep used for meat, actually, is more common. And then Brian touched on the different policies that are encouraging pollinator-friendly vegetation. So the honey that you see down there is actually from beehives kept on solar farms, and it's a great way to have some benefits. And one of our research activities here in coordination with Argonne National Laboratory is finding that existing and planned solar farms could, if they are planted with pollinator-friendly vegetation, could provide support for 3,500 square kilometers of agricultural crops that are highly pollinator dependent and near those solar farms. So there could be a strong agricultural benefit, but that has to be planned for, like Brian mentioned. If nothing else, you can require low-impact solar development and require planting with vegetation that is native and low growth and doesn't require irrigation. And that will obviously do a lot in terms of soil restoration and reducing runoff, sedimentation, and erosion. And another thing to consider with these larger facilities is lot coverage and impervious surface. As you've seen in these pictures, water can flow between the panels and underneath the panels and support vegetation growth. So it's important to not consider the entire solar farm as an impervious surface, much like a parking lot, because it certainly isn't. And that will, in turn, require a lot of retention, detention, and stormwater to take up a lot of that land with ponds, etc., that aren't necessary. So something to consider in your development regulations. And also lot coverage. Sometimes you can see lot coverage limited to as little as 10% of a lot. And as you can see in this cooperative solar installation, which is a community solar farm, they're using the whole lot. And so if you're requiring them to be limited to something like a building footprint, that's going to severely restrict solar development. And of course, a co-benefit can be using sites that are undevelopable for other reasons, like landfills, gray fields, brown fields. And so it's a great reuse of otherwise undevelopable land. But do recognize that that brings an added cost and time requirement for that development. So it will increase the cost of the associated electricity. but it's a great land use. So there's also a lot of opportunities for encouraging solar in your zoning code. Things like you could require or have an option for solar-ready construction for planned unit developments, or provide bonuses like a height bonus or reduced parking for integrating solar energy into different developments. So I'm going to mention a couple different resources that may help you in your solar energy planning. Brian mentioned the Google Project Sunroof that has many, many cities, not all, and they have a Data Explorer version where you can look at the solar rooftop potential of all the roofs in your entire city and the generation capacity associated with that area that is solar viable. And then the state and local energy data site that I manage here at NREL for the Department of Energy has a wealth of information on energy in your communities for every single U.S. city, and it includes the small building rooftop PV potential estimate for every single U.S. city. So the estimate of how many buildings as well as your generation capacity and area. And then just to touch on some research that we've done here at NREL, we took a look at how cities are including clean energy in their codes across the country and found that solar, and that's the yellow part of those donuts, solar was by far the most prominent clean energy keyword that we found referenced in zoning codes and codes across the country. And then I was able to match that up to the city level solar capacity installed in each of those cities where we had the data. So we found that there's a very strong correlation between those cities that have references to solar in their codes and higher amounts of installed PV capacity. So it makes a difference. I'm not going to tell you it's a causational relationship, but it certainly can't hurt to include solar in your zoning codes and make sure that you can capture some of those co-benefits and development benefits for your community. So I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Megan. Our next and final speaker is James Schroll, so we'll have him bring up his screen.
Great. All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Well, again, my name is James Schroll. I'm a project manager at the Solar Foundation, and I work on a program called SolSmart, and I have the pleasure of working with Megan Day, who you just heard from on that program, and have had the opportunity to collaborate with Brian Ross on some of this as well. So great to be with them both again, and also to be with you all. So I'm going to go over SolSmart pretty quickly here, and happy to answer kind of any questions afterward about the program. So
James, are you sharing your screen? I'm not. Are you sharing your screen, James? I can't see it.
I was before, but let's try again.
Sounds good.
Sorry about that.
Great. Now it's great. Just hide that thing on the bottom, and then you'll be good to go.
Yep. Perfect. Sorry about that, everybody.
Thanks.
So one of the here's a list of kind of survey results and the common barriers to solar. And as you can see, one of the biggest ones at the bottom is the high upfront cost of solar. There's some other barriers as well, but policy support, lack of education, but cost is clearly one of the big ones. And if you look at cost, you have hardware cost and those what we call soft costs, which are the non-hardware costs. You can see in this chart, while cost has come down, those soft costs are still a large share, and most of the reduction in price is due to hardware cost reductions. So what do we mean when we talk about soft costs? What's these types of things? Permitting, inspection, financing, customer acquisition, and also kind of labor costs. You can see they still constitute a pretty large share of those costs. So why do we care? Well, one of them is that those soft costs can add a significant portion to the cost of installation, and streamlining those processes can reduce the cost of solar dramatically. As you can see on this slide, it's about $2,500. The other reason we care is because there are a lot of solar jobs, and a lot of those jobs are local jobs. As you can see, there are over 250,000 solar workers in the United States, increased by 168% since 2010. Again, most of those are installation jobs. So you can see the bottom of the screen. Those are installation jobs, and those jobs are reflecting a megawatts of installation for those jobs. For every megawatt, you get the jobs at the bottom of the screen. And so those can be a great reason for localities to address this issue. And also installers do avoid locations with difficult permitting, inspection processes, difficult zoning and planning. About 2/3 of installers say that they avoid localities with difficult processes. So what are the takeaways? Well, soft costs comprise a large share of installation costs. People avoid the communities where those are difficult. There's an economic benefit to addressing those issues, and local governments clearly have a role to play here, as many of these issues that we'll discuss are things that are within a local government's ability to address. So I want to go over the SolarSmart program here and how it kind of works to address those concerns that I raised. So the program is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and its goal is to make it faster, easier, and more affordable for residents and businesses to go solar. Our goal is to recognize at least 300 communities that have taken that step and designate them at the bronze, silver, and gold level for their work, and provide them technical assistance in that. So here's the SolarSmart team. We have a technical assistance delivery team managed by the Solar Foundation, where I work, and you can see all the organizations, including NREL, where Megan is, on that side. And then we have a designation team as well, managed by the International City County Management Association, along with some other partners. We are on that team too, and you can see how that team breaks down. So our program has developed a list of criteria that communities can go through to achieve those bronze, silver, and gold levels, and we'll talk about that momentarily. We worked with a number of organizations that you can see on the slide. I won't go through all of them, but you can see some big names to develop the criteria for SolarSmart. You can see organizations here that have solar background, renewable energy background, like Connecticut Green Bank, NREL, North Carolina Clean Energy Center, and then organizations that represent local governments on here, like ICMA, also GPI, where Brian is here, that has worked with localities and also on kind of renewable energy, and helped us create some what we think is a pretty good set of criteria for SolarSmart. So SolarSmart has 8 categories of actions. There are 2 foundational categories, as you can see on the left, one of which is planning, zoning, and development regulations, which is a foundational, as we say, a foundational category of the program, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. And then there are special focus categories on the right here, where kind of choose your own adventure. Communities can choose various actions there that they might want to pursue, and the remaining 6 there. And then if local governments think that they've done something that's outside of the scope of the program, we do allow for innovative actions. Communities can apply and say we've done something we think that's innovative, and then we have a team that reviews that as well. So some communities in the country don't control some of the main elements of our program, planning, zoning, permitting, inspections, things along those lines. We have created a modified pathway for those jurisdictions so they can still participate in the program. So if that's what you think your community is, you can still participate as well. As I mentioned, we provide technical assistance to communities that are pursuing designation. It's about 100 hours of no-cost technical assistance per community, and so that can take the form of webinars like this, over the phone TA, traveling sometimes to communities to help them, providing resources. We also have SolSmart advisors. These are program-funded staff. They work in the community for up to 6 months to help those local governments, think through their standards, processes, and then apply best practices and help that local government achieve SolSmart designation. Happy to talk more about this. We will be launching the 3rd round of the SolSmart Advisor program later this year, so happy to chat about that if that's of interest. Promised that I would talk a little bit more about some of the examples of planning and zoning TA we have in the program, so you can see a list of those here. A lot of it's around reviewing zoning ordinance language, helping draft more solar-friendly zoning language to allow solar as a by right accessory use. As Megan mentioned, providing those clear guidance for solar in historic or special use districts, providing incentives for solar on underutilized properties, whether that's exemptions from any kind of regulation, setback requirements, things like that, or whether it's density if there's other things on site. Providing a regulatory pathway for primary use solar PV, and also kind of clarifying whether ground mount solar PV is allowable use. Some of you who might be more familiar with solar may know that there is a Solar Powering Your Community guidebook that was put out in 2011 through another DOE-funded program. It's a great resource, great introduction to solar, and we are updating that guidebook, and we're including a section on planning and zoning. The initial guidebook didn't include one, and our goal is to have this out in the springtime frame of this year, hopefully by April, but spring of this year. Here's a map of our existing participants. These are our designees on the map here. We have over 230 communities that are participating. They're in the pipeline. They're not designated. We have 188 designees as of today in 35 states, which represents over 64 million Americans. So briefly go through kind of what 2 communities have done here. I won't go through all of what Will County did. You can look on the screen here. Will County did get gold SolSmart designation, and they did review their zoning ordinance, and they also, I guess I did not mention this here, but they have updated it to allow solar as a by right accessory use. And in Charlottesville, Virginia, had the benefit of a SolSmart advisor. They achieved silver designation. They amended their zoning ordinance as well, to allow solar as a by right accessory use. They're considering doing some additional amendments later on ground mounts for parking lots, but they've also taken some other actions here as well. So that concludes my presentation. Again, happy to answer any questions you may have about SolSmart. Thanks again for your interest.
Great, thank you, James. Let's see here, I'll pull up the final slide here. Okay, we are going to have a Q&A portion now. We have some questions in the queue, but if you have any further questions, please feel free to submit them in the attendee chat box or using the Q&A function that looks like a little chat bubble on your screen. Going back pretty early in the webinar, there was a question, rather a statement, I guess, about if people could discuss battery storage concepts as it relates to solar. Would anyone like to share some thoughts on that?
Sure, this is Megan. So I'm actually doing, proposing some research and some guidance for how local jurisdictions should regulate storage, and specifically solar plus storage. So what we're seeing is as solar energy proliferates more across the country, in order to integrate greater amounts of solar, battery storage at utility scale can be used to help balance out the intermittent resource that solar provides, right? So when cloud cover comes over, or as we enter high demand, low solar generation times of the day, like 5, 6 p.m., the battery storage can extend that life. So for those of you with land, I think you're going to see a lot more, as I mentioned, storage associated with that solar energy development at the grid scale and utility scale. As far as residential scale, mostly the use of batteries is a way to provide electricity when the electricity goes out on the grid. So you have to be able to island your residence or your commercial building so that you're not feeding electricity back onto the grid through your battery usage, because that's a safety concern when people are working to get the grid back up and running. So we do expect a lot more battery deployment in the coming 10 years, and to the extent that battery storage costs have dropped so dramatically, much like solar panels, their costs have dropped. And so people are now looking at battery storage replacing gas peaker plants in the next 5 to 10 years because it's a cheaper option as load increases to add storage rather than a full gas peaker. It's a quicker option as well, which is what they did in California recently. So as far as the land use, there's obviously not as an intense as far as the acreage required for battery storage, but if I could show you some pictures, I would, of some larger facilities. It can be an acre of solar battery storage kind of banks, and so I think it's important to understand, the risks and the dangers and the land use considerations associated with that. So I'm proposing to do just that over the next year.
Great, thanks, Megan. Brian or James, any thought on that question?
This is Brian, and the primary issue that is probably really an issue that Megan addressed is kind of the utility scale, the larger storage. The question does come up sometimes about kind of the more building scale or residential scale storage, where it isn't really an issue from the zoning standpoint or land use standpoint. And I just want to give an example. The Tesla solar wall is about a 10 kilowatt hour battery. That's the battery that goes inside a residential home to go with the Tesla solar roof. The Tesla solar car that's in the garage is about a 100 kilowatt hour battery. So it's 10 times the size. And if you're not going to be concerned about the car in the garage, then you probably don't need to be concerned about the battery in the garage. You don't need to be concerned about the battery in the house. I just wanted to add that piece.
Great, thanks. Megan, there was a question during your presentation about the roof-mounted setbacks and how to coordinate with fire chiefs. There was a question of whether IFC requires 3 feet. Can you speak to that?
Oh, that's a good question. I can send out a document with a link to the IFC solar considerations. So I'm not sure if they require 3 feet. 3 feet has been required by certain jurisdictions and fire departments. I know Boulder went back and forth with planning and the fire department to try to allow for more solar, less setbacks, and I think they finally got a good compromise. So I've seen between a foot and 3 feet as the setbacks that have been negotiated and required by local jurisdictions and fire departments. So, but I'm not sure off the top of my head if 3 feet is what the IFC requires.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll
thank you.
If I can just add to that,
sure.
Some of the jurisdictions that we've worked with have had discussions with their fire departments where the fire department basically said, we're not worrying about it. We're not worrying about it yet. And so from a zoning standpoint, the jurisdiction said, okay, we're not going to include it in our code. If it becomes an issue, we'll address it via the building code or the building permit process rather than the zoning code. So that's just one way that some people have addressed that at the local level.
Right, and that's what I would recommend. If your fire department is not concerned, then don't worry about it in your zoning code.
This is James.
Great, thank you to both.
To the questioner, if who's interested in maybe some more of the fine-grained details, solarabcs.org, which stands for Solar America Boards for Codes and Standards, has some great information about solar as it relates to building code, fire code, things of that nature. Recommend that to the questioner and anybody else who's kind of interested in getting down in the weeds.
Great, thanks, James. The next question I think was asked during Megan's presentation, but anyone feel free to jump in. The person said, we currently regulate solar as a mechanical, which requires screening, for example, fencing and landscaping. Another option would be to regulate as an accessory structure which doesn't require screening. Do you exempt solar from screening?
That's a common exemption that we encourage folks to have. Generally, there are certain things on rooftops that are exempt from screening, like a satellite dish or something. And so we encourage folks to add solar to those things that are exempted from rooftop screening. As far as ground-mounted, there's plenty of communities who want to screen it so they don't have to look at it. I don't think it's such an ugly thing to look at. And of course, screening can cause shading, so you might be eliminating the efficacy or the efficiency of your system by requiring screening. So there are lots of different approaches for ground-mounted screening, be it landscaping or fencing, that I've seen. So, but I think for the most part, I would encourage you to regulate a ground-mounted smaller system like an accessory structure. And you can apply the setbacks and height restrictions and any screening requirements that might apply to an accessory structure. If you're going to require a shed to be screened, people are probably going to want the solar screens as well.
And this is Brian, we deal with this a lot. We generally think that if you're for rooftop systems, no screening is really required. it isn't something that has created a lot of problems. There's sometimes a few people who get up in arms about it, but generally the community doesn't care that much, we've discovered. However, if you insist on putting a screening requirement in or having some language about screening in the code, we would just add the language, except, screening is required except to the extent that it affects the performance of the system. You don't require screening of a chimney such that you would have to put something over the top of the chimney and prevent it from functioning properly, because that, the functional purpose of the equipment is what you want to protect. And just to kind of recognize that as well for solar, if there's any kind of a screening requirement, it should not affect the performance of the system.
Great, thank you. Question for anyone. Are there grants or incentives to small/rural towns and cities to encourage the use of SESs, which I assume is solar energy systems? Something like that.
Well, you get 100 hours of SolarSmart.
Yeah. I guess is the question directed at at subsidies for the installation costs or subsidies to help address it in their regulations?
It just says to encourage the use of systems. If the question asker wants to clarify, they can certainly.
So there are some grants through the U.S. Department of Energy. One is called the Rural Energy for America program that does encourage renewable energy systems, energy efficiency. It may not be exactly what the questioner is looking for, but there's certainly some grants out there for that, and you can look up if where you live is eligible for those grants they have a kind of are you rural or are you not rural tool to check if you're from an eligible location.
Great, thank you. Next question is this person has concerns that they've heard about what typically happens to the panels after the 25 years or their lifespan. How are they disposed of, and are there any environmental concerns that should be addressed in policies?
Sure. So some communities will, for larger facilities, have a decommissioning plan requirement, which will include the removal of the facility and all of the equipment and recycling and reuse of those materials. I do want to assure folks that solar modules are encased in glass, and there are generally no toxic materials except for, and some minor exceptions with certain types of panels, but you have to put the module into like an industrial incinerator in order to have those materials leach out. So in the case of a ground-mounted system, a grass fire is not going to do it, even if that fire came through this facility. So as far as ground-mounted, you don't have to worry about the soil underneath the facility being contaminated in any way. It's just water hitting glass and running off, and so that's not a toxic concern. The recycling programs, as the industry has shifted and over time, companies go out of business, so you may not have the original module manufacturer with their warranty and recycling program at the end of your facility life. Generally, modules have a 25-year warranty, and at the end of those 25 years, at a 0.5% degradation rate each year, they're still generating at about 80% of their original capacity after 25 years. So you may see these systems last for 30, 40 years in some cases if those modules are still working and not broken. But at the end, yeah, it's important to make sure that they're recycled properly and not just thrown into your landfill. So there's some regulations that you might want to consider on that end.
Great, thank you. Any quick advice or something to be aware of with a solar power purchase agreement or PPA?
Oh, we're putting together right now a program for cities and counties to train them on how to work on solar procurement. So I'm recording something tomorrow and the next day, and that will all be available through NREL and the Department of Energy to help cities understand considerations for power purchase agreements and other RFP procurement options for cities, including just leasing land for solar. So a lot of resources out there coming in the near future. And then there's also model PPAs and the like. So I would encourage you to Google NREL and PPA, and you could probably find some of those pretty easily. You can also go to the NREL State, Local, and Tribal Energy, and you'll see the first of the several installments and modules for the training that I mentioned under local governments.
Yeah, and this is Brian. We have discovered that you do have to take some care with PPAs. There are different states regulate them and how they're applied in different ways, and so we have seen some difference across states in regard to the way that PPAs are presented to people or to institutions. There is some information that is a little bit more Minnesota-specific or Midwest-specific on the Clean Energy Resource Team website here regarding PPAs. They've developed some kind of standard questions and protection documents as well. It sounds like Megan and NREL maybe will have more up-to-date information, but there is some additional sources of information, and you do need to be careful. There are some, unfortunately, a few bad examples out there that have created a bit of a headache for us. In spite of all the really good options that PPAs can provide and the additional financing options and affordability options that they provide.
Thank you. We have a few more questions here. What is your experience eliminating barriers getting utility-scale solar into the grid? For example, in rural areas where grid capacity is less than peak production. Is battery storage an option for releasing energy at off-peak times?
So yes, it is an option. Generally, if you have a principal or primary use solar farm, you have a PPA from the utility or generation and transmission company where they're not looking at necessarily the local load, but they're looking at their grid needs and serving those needs. Or they might be looking at meeting a renewable portfolio standard requirement. Or they might be looking at communities that are coming to them to say, we want 100% renewable energy. So there's all these considerations that utilities have and what kinds of generation they're bringing onto the grid. So yes, more and more utilities are going to want storage associated with larger PV facilities in order to smooth out those generation profiles and extend it to times of the day where they have greater load. But you as a community don't need to be worried about the generation unless you're net metering and you want to match that generation to your load at the site, if that makes any sense. So you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, could you repeat the question? I'm not quite sure I gathered all of it.
Sure. What is your experience eliminating barriers getting utility-scale solar into the grid? For example, in rural areas where grid capacity is less than peak production. Is battery storage an option for releasing energy at off-peak times?
Oh, okay. So yeah, this is related to the actual in rural areas where we might have limited grid interconnection capacity. Usually, battery storage is not typically thought of as by the utilities that have the interconnection authority to mitigate. Although that may be changing, it is a potential way to deal with it, to divert peak power production. There are some other ways, but it may be arguable that it's probably that the cheapest way to deal with it is just to upgrade the system in a manner to allow for additional capacity. So it's there. We have seen this in a few rural areas where the interconnection capacity is simply too small to support a utility scale farm, and that there are limited ways to address that. And most of the utilities, though, currently are not kind of accepting battery storage as an option for that.
Thank you. There was a question about whether a USDA program is still available for rural systems, and I saw that James put a link into the attendee chat box, so feel free to check that out. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that, James?
Yeah, I did put the link there for that. It does look like the funds can be used for solar PV. There are some size limitations in terms of how much of the grant can be used. My understanding is it's a rolling application. I don't think there's time cutoffs, but please check me on that. And there's at the top of the page of the link I linked to, there's a kind of who's eligible, and it's an area, city or town, an area that has fewer than 50,000 inhabitants, so or ag land. So just to kind of check your eligibility there.
Great, thanks for sending that out. We have one last question we'll try to squeeze in here. My community allows for rooftop systems in residential. However, we have been getting requests for ground-mounted systems. How would a community address stacked or pole-mounted systems in residential districts?
Great question, and I would encourage you to create a regulatory pathway. One of the ways to do that is to expand your definitions to include ground-mounted small systems and regulate them as an accessory structure. Like we mentioned before, there are a lot of resources out there that I wish I had put more links to in my slides as far as model zoning codes that would help you address that in your code. So, for example, Massachusetts has a model zoning code that's very good. Brian has developed a number of solar toolkits for Midwestern communities. The Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission has some model zoning, as does the state of North Carolina, and the APA has a number of resources. And then SoulSmart has a lot of resources listed on their website, so soulsmart.org, to find model zoning codes that would help allow that. If you are a SoulSmart community, we can help you draft some language specific to that concern. So you might want to just regulate it as an accessory structure for now if you're getting applications in, and but try to work it into your zoning code as soon as possible so that you have a regulatory pathway.
Yeah, this is James. I'd add to what Megan said, which is great. There are tons of model codes out there. Some things to look for when looking at ground mounts. One is lot coverage. Megan mentioned that. A lot of communities would regulate a ground mount and limit its size because of lot coverage. You would not want to do that as long as what's beneath that ground mount is pervious surface, not impervious. Setbacks can be an issue. The size of the ground mount sometimes is regulated by the square footage of an allowed accessory use on the site. So think sheds, things like that, would potentially limit the size. So you might want to consider those types of things. Height limitations might be an issue depending on how they're written. So those would be all things to consider. But as Megan said, we'd be happy to talk to you and get down into specifics if your community is considering kind of going in this direction.
Yeah, and I'll just say, it's free to get into SoulSmart. They give you free assistance. It's a great program. That's your answer in the near, kind of in the near term, I think.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our speakers. Again, this will be recording will be posted at sustainableplanning.net within the next couple of days. Yeah, thank you. Hope to see you next time.